Hi, I'm Matt Geiger. My goal is to get you the full, unbiased story on issues, not the liberal story or the conservative story. Recently, free trade has been a huge topic of discussion. For decades, we've been reducing our tariffs, opening our country to international trade. But recently, public perception has suddenly turned against free trade. My goal is to make sure you have all the facts. In this video, I'm going to explain international trade between America and its partners as it exists today. So let's get started. This big circle here is going to represent all of our normal trading partners. We trade with almost every country in some way, shape, or form, and they're in this circle. But I want to get a few oddball countries out of the way first, just so we can focus on the majority of our trade. The US limits its trade with some countries to just agriculture products with some really high tariffs. We're talking in the neighborhood of 40%, 50% tariffs depending on the product. In some countries, it doesn't even trade with at all. The US has passed specific sanctions against most of these countries, but I'm not going to get into too much detail on these, just so you're aware that they do exist. This includes countries like your North Korea and your Cuba. Among our current trade partners, basically all of them belong to the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization has 151 current member countries, which encompass 96.4% of all world trade, so essentially all trade. The WTO essentially organizes and enforces a set of agreements negotiated over the course of the last few decades, under which member countries have agreed to certain limits on their tariffs and non-tariff protections. The World Trade Organization is mainly based on a set of overriding principles. Understanding these will help us understand both the organization and also the rules that govern the vast majority of all international trade. First one's non-discrimination. A country needs to offer the same terms to all member countries. So the US has a 2.5% tariff on imported cars. It can't just hike its tariff on another member like China or Japan exclusively. On top of non-discrimination, member countries need to offer national treatment. What this means is treating foreign goods the same as domestic goods once they've actually entered the domestic market. The WTO works to lower trade barriers among all member nations. With each round of agreements, member countries have reduced tariffs. The understanding under these agreements is that nations with more mature economies should have lower tariff rates, and developing economies can be allowed to maintain higher barriers to protect developing domestic industries. Average tariff rates range from about 2% for the more developed countries to the low double digits in undeveloped countries. The World Trade Organization also provides certainty in international trade. It administers the application of agreed upon rules among members, including protection of intellectual property, helps meld the WTO rules with specific bilateral agreements, and it provides a forum to resolve trade disputes among member countries. So, what does this all mean for America specifically? Well, here are the tariff rates that we charge other WTO countries to import goods into the United States. The US has a weighted average tariff rate, that's the tax we charge on inputs, of 2.2%, but keep in mind the rates vary by individual product. Our average tariff rate is at the low end of all WTO nations, but in the same ballpark as other members with developed economies, usually in the range of 2% to like 3.5%. Economies that are in the process of developing, but not quite mature, like China, are usually a bit higher, in the ballpark of 4% to 6%, and then the majority of countries have small, undeveloped economies, and the average weighted tariff in those countries tends to be between 7% and 15%. Keep in mind this is still low by historical standards. The US routinely had average tariff rates in the 30 to 60% range, up until World War II. The majority of imports into the US are machinery, equipment, and basic materials. Not surprisingly, the average tariffs on these items hover around our overall average, with the one exception of petroleum. But here are the real standouts, the products that we put the highest tariffs on. They're mainly agriculture and clothing products, but higher tariffs on these items aren't just unique to America. Most countries protect their own agriculture industries in various ways, whether through tariffs or some other means. Because of that, the most recent WTO meetings have focused on reducing agriculture protections, but they haven't had much success. So the World Trade Organization agreements help explain the majority of our international trade, but a huge chunk of our trade, about a third of all imports, run through free trade agreements. The North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, gets the most attention, but we have free trade agreements with 20 different countries. Each one was individually negotiated, so terms are slightly different, but there are enough commonalities that we can talk about how they work more generally across all of them. About a third of all imports enter the United States under a free trade agreement with one of these countries, and almost half of all of our exports are sold to a country that we have a free trade agreement with. Most of these truly are free trade agreements, as in they significantly reduce tariffs and non-tariff barriers. For the most part, agreements eliminate all tariffs either immediately or after a 5 or 10-year phase-out period. The one exception to this is, not surprisingly, agricultural goods, as we saw earlier. The agriculture parts of agreements vary based on the country. For example, we negotiated a 15-year tariff phase-out period on agriculture with Mexico, while our agreement with Canada still has tariff quotas and other protections on specific agriculture goods. On top of goods, the free trade agreements usually open countries up to service industries like telecommunications, professional industries, and financial services. They protect intellectual property rights, and they typically include commitments to protect environmental and labor rights laws. So that's the status of our laws as they exist today. Recently, President Obama has been negotiating more free trade agreements, specifically the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a free trade agreement that would add Japan, Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei, and New Zealand to the list of countries we have free trade with. This agreement is close to the same as existing free trade agreements, but it puts a little extra emphasis on environmental and labor concerns. To benefit from free trade, countries need to implement laws recognizing the right to collectively bargain, as well as minimum wage, child labor laws, and discrimination laws. A separate agreement, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, is also in the works as a free trade zone with the European Union. But details on this one are still being worked out. As public perception in America increasingly turns against free trade, it's looking increasingly unlikely that we'll continue to approve these free trade agreements, especially with President Trump specifically opposing the free trade agreements already in place. I just want to warn people that this issue specifically has a lot of money at stake on both sides. When more lobbyist dollars are involved, it just means that you need to be more vocal to make your own voice heard, regardless of which side you stand on. Call or write your representative and senators to let them know how you feel, and that's the only way we're going to overcome the effect of the money that's being thrown at our politicians. Thanks for watching.